Good afternoon, class. We'll pick up where we left off in class today, and of course we began discussing the experience of Japan in the early modern period as it was making this really important transition from a rather medieval form of society, which was characterized very much by the sort of decentralized power structure, very similar in many respects to Europe during its Middle Age era, where we had power decentralized and held among the nobility that was scattered very much throughout the European countryside in various domains and kingdoms. A similar phenomenon was taking place in Japan all the way up through the year 1600. In fact, several centuries of rivalry between various daimyo and aristocratic families had really created a prolonged period of instability inside of Japan. And in class we discussed a little bit about how in some ways Japan and China had a somewhat similar existence during this period of time, because they both demonstrated a reluctance to embrace the influence and presence of outsiders, and particularly Western or European outsiders. But one aspect that makes them quite different is the fact that whereas China seemed to, nonchalantly or confidently reject the influence of Western traders and Western explorers, in the case of Japan, it came to be something that was a little bit more tense, and I used the example in class that almost something that bordered on the paranoia. But if we look at the history of Japan, we know that for much of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, Japan had experienced tremendous instability. And so it perhaps makes sense that in 1600, after Japan was finally unified, that the people who were establishing this power, the early leaders of the Tokugawa Shogunate, it makes sense on some level that they would take extra steps to try to maintain the stability and order of Japanese societies. So we left off, Japan was a unique part of East Asia during this period of time, in many respects because it's a relatively small part of East Asia. It's an island off the coast of, the east coast of the Pacific, of the Asian mainland. But yet it was free. It was not controlled or spoken for by some nearby civilization. This was unlike the experience of Taiwan, unlike the experience of the Philippines, unlike some of the islands in the East Indies that were colonized by the Dutch, so on and so forth. So Japan is very much trying to find its own way, and it's enjoying this new period of stability. Now, I mentioned in class briefly that one of the secrets of the early Tokugawa reforms was this tax reform, and the fact that lands were now being surveyed more carefully, more critically. Tax rates were set in a way that really took into account what a piece of property could produce. And I didn't say this in class, but not only was this beneficial because it allowed more land to enter into circulation, and it allowed people to keep a larger portion, in many cases a larger portion of their profits. But the other thing is in the previous system where taxation was really arbitrary, you can imagine what that did to the incentive of the producer. I mean, if you're a farmer, say, growing rice or producing other vegetables for the local economy, if you're not clear as to how much of that money is going to be taxed, you can see how that would really impact your incentive to provide. I mean, things are being sort of made up as they go. Why would you want to produce more only so that the emperor, the shogun, would take a larger portion of your produce? So this really helped to incentivize and even make the economy something a little bit closer to a capitalist system like we observe throughout many parts of the world today. So that was one of the major economic reforms. But a cultural reform that was necessary had to do with these new samurai. I shouldn't say new samurai. The samurai had been around for centuries. But what's new about this is now we have the shogun who's clearly in charge. So if you think about that, you have all these former daimyo. They still exist. They're still going to be honored. They still hold their titles. But now they have less of a clear need for their samurai retainers. You know, it's like they don't need these knights to fight on their behalf, because now the order of society is much more clearly established. So the real question becomes what to do. Now, fortunately, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had already helped address this issue by undertaking the sword hunts of the late 16th century, whereby he stripped the swords from large numbers of the rural people, some of whom were essentially samurai, but in a really kind of almost comical or questionable way. They did not have the typical training or the prestige or the skill level that a samurai had demonstrated up until this really interesting period in Japan's history. So now it fell to Toyotomi to essentially restore the samurai to its former glory, and he was able to do this in a way that also served his interests in centralizing his control, because he took these swords out of circulation, which meant he had more power because he got to determine who controlled the sort of means to violence and the means to imposing order within Japanese society. And, you know, I think I was mentioning this maybe briefly in class, this would be kind of like the federal government in the United States going through and taking arms out of circulation, firearms. Now, you can imagine the uproar that would result from something like that. But the mere fact that Toyotomi could do this was sort of a statement of his power. Now, what this meant was what to do with these samurai, not just the old samurai who had essentially had their swords taken from them, but how about the samurai that still got to keep their swords, the ones that were actually skilled and incredible fighters and very honorable and dutiful and loyal devotees of their lords? Well, the new samurai code became referred to as the Code of Bushido. And essentially what's now going to happen is the samurai will still contain or retain many of their martial skills. They'll still be trained in the arts of war. But, of course, war is now going to be less common, so the samurai will also sort of double as incredibly well-versed, well-behaved civilians. So the samurai is going to become sort of this new sort of privileged class that's known for its restraint, but also its dedication to fight when they have to, but also display many of the accomplishments and restraint and duties of the very refined civilian. So samurai will become some of the best teachers in Japan. They will, for the most part, they'll be supported by the aristocracy, but they're going to be a really stabilizing and really refined presence within Japanese society during the early Tokugawa era. So some things are changing here. We have a new taxation system. We have some new cultural norms that are going to be placed upon the samurai. We know that the daimyo, based on my comments in class, the daimyo are being essentially relocated to various parts based on how much the shogun can trust them. And this really sets the stage quite nicely for a market expansion within Japan. And so Japan, we talked about in the early 1600s, they do seclude themselves. They shut themselves off to the west, with a small exception of the port of Osaka down here, where Japan does conduct limited trade with the Dutch and this serves as a place that some of Europe's influence comes inside the boundaries of Japan. But that's just an annual shipment that the Dutch can send, and the Dutch presence is quite limited. But it's enough of a thing that if you can speak Dutch and you live in Japan, it became sort of a sign of your sophistication and a sign of your somewhat elite status. But the trade actually does continue outside of Japan, and that is largely with mainland China and Korea. And here we know that China has developed quite an appetite for silver. It has recently started receiving silver from the Spanish galleons that come into China via the Philippines. But Japan is also supplementing the demand that China has for silver. Japan's also trading porcelain, paper, brushes, vases, and things like that into China, and in exchange obtaining things like silks and porcelain, the kind of classic Qing era porcelain. I guess you'd call them vases, but they're a little different than the Japanese vases. And so there's a lively trade happening between Japan and the mainland. But Japan is doing its best to keep Western countries at bay. As I mentioned in class, the major cities that established, there are a number of them. But essentially, Kyoto remains the sort of capital of Japan, and that's where the emperor's palace is. Edo becomes the shogunate's realm, which is really responsible for the power and also much of the government of Japan. And then Osaka becomes a major commercial hub. I think what's important for us to understand here is that as Japan enters into sort of its early modern phase, Japan does have a little bit of an identity crisis, and it has tried to invade China. But Japan also features a Confucianist tradition, one that it inherited from China. Much of Japan's writing, while it's not identical to the characters that the Chinese script employs, it's closely adapted from China. And you could look without too much trouble to find a number of ways in which Japan appears to be sort of the younger brother or a civilization that's inherited most of its defining traits from China. And this is actually a source of problem for the Japanese. But the Japanese do point to things, ways in which they are authentically their own. The Japanese do try to keep, on some level, keep Buddhism to a minimum, because they know that it's a foreign influence that's come to them by way of China. The Japanese actually take great pride in their Shinto tradition, and Shintoism is essentially a religious system where the Japanese very much paid attention to different relics or objects in nature, and oftentimes attached a certain power to them, and adapted sort of charms as various symbols of power, and one could hold a number of objects of nature as something holy. And Shinto became just a source of something authentically Japanese, and for that the Japanese were all too eager to call attention to it. Now, my final comment I will make is simply that after 1710, Japan reaches some real challenges, some of which are ecological, some of which have to do with their population, which I say really crests at 30 million people. And this starts to put Japan on a slow and steady decline. The first 100+ years of Tokugawa rule were fantastically beneficial. But this time from 710 to 1853 are going to be some signs of internal decay, whereby the Japanese agriculture and society struggles ever more to provide for itself and meet its needs and interests as a growing power in the region. So in 1853, when it does have renewed contact with the European West. Japan finds itself quite a bit more open to pursuing that. And with that, I will stop.